when 17-year-old Brandon Mitchell grabbed the sledgehammer from shop class and swung it down onto the new teacher's wooden desk, splintering it into a dozen pieces while screaming, "Welcome to hell, lady!" The entire classroom of Jefferson Reform Academy erupted into chaos. For 3 years running, no educator had survived more than a month under his brutal campaign of psychological warfare. His uncle's position as district superintendent made him bulletproof, his gang connections made him dangerous, and his crew of devoted followers made him seemingly invincible. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. What Brandon didn't realize was that the calm woman watching her destroyed desk had spent 7 years perfecting her craft in underground fight clubs across Chicago's South Side. What he couldn't see beneath her conservative cardigan were scars from battles that had tested her limits against opponents who fought for survival, not entertainment. What he never imagined was that his next move would result in him sobbing on the floor, begging forgiveness from the woman he'd tried to break, while 28 students recorded every humiliating second on their phones. In the next 4 minutes, Brandon Mitchell would transform from Jefferson Academy's most feared predator into a broken shell of his former self. And every teacher who'd ever walked away defeated would finally witness what happens when unstoppable cruelty meets immovable resolve. The November rain hammered against the bulletproof windows of Jefferson Reform Academy as Sarah Martinez pulled her beat-up Ford Focus into the employee parking lot. The building loomed before her like a fortress designed to contain rather than educate, its red brick walls scarred by decades of frustration, and its entrance flanked by metal detectors that had seen more action than most police stations. At 28, Sarah carried herself with the quiet intensity of someone who'd clawed their way out of circumstances most people never escaped. Her dark hair was pulled into a simple bun, and her navy cardigan concealed a lean frame built through years of conditioning that went far beyond typical fitness routines. Growing up in Chicago's Pilsen neighborhood, she'd learned that respect was currency earned through actions, not words. Jefferson Reform Academy served as the final stop for students expelled from every other institution in the district. It was where kids with violence charges, drug convictions, and family connections to organized crime came to either straighten out their lives or confirm society's worst expectations. The teaching position paid barely enough to cover her student loans, but Sarah had specifically sought out this challenge. She believed that the kids others had written off deserved someone who wouldn't abandon them when things got difficult. Principal Margaret Stone met Sarah at the security checkpoint, her weathered face bearing the expression of someone who'd spent 15 years managing controlled chaos. At 55, Stone had developed the survival instincts of a corrections officer combined with the heart of an advocate for lost causes. "Miss Martinez, welcome to Jefferson," Stone said, her voice carrying the weight of experience. "I'll be direct with you. This isn't a normal teaching environment. Our students come from situations that would break most adults." The last 4 English teachers lasted an average of 3 weeks before requesting transfers. As they walked through corridors lined with reinforced glass and motivational posters that seemed almost satirical given the setting, Stone explained the reality Sarah was entering. Most students carried trauma that manifested as aggression. Many had witnessed violence that would haunt adults. All of them had been labeled as problems by a system that preferred removal over rehabilitation. "Your biggest challenge will be Brandon Mitchell and his inner circle," Stone warned as they approached classroom 47. "Brandon's uncle is Superintendent Williams, so the boy operates with effective immunity. He's built a culture of intimidation that affects every aspect of school life. His followers include Marcus Rodriguez, who's facing assault charges in juvenile court, and Tommy Chen, whose family connections make him dangerous in ways I can't discuss officially." Sarah studied the classroom that would become her battlefield. The space was utilitarian and cold, with fluorescent lighting that cast harsh shadows and desks that bore the scars of countless frustrated students. But she'd taught summer programs in community centers where gang tags covered every surface, so at least this place had functioning heat and intact windows. What Principal Stone didn't know was that Sarah Martinez had been training in mixed martial arts since her 19th birthday. After surviving a brutal home invasion that left her hospitalized during her sophomore year of college, she'd walked into Warrior's Heart Gym on Chicago's South Side and dedicated herself to ensuring she'd never be helpless again. 7 years of Muay Thai, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and boxing had transformed her from victim to predator. Her instructor, Elena Lightning Vasquez, was a former professional fighter who taught Sarah that combat wasn't about anger or dominance. It was about problem-solving under extreme pressure. Every technique served a purpose. Every movement was calculated. And the most dangerous opponents were those who remained calm when others lost control. Fighting is a conversation, Elena had explained during Sarah's early training. Most people are just screaming. Champions listen first, then respond with precision. The goal isn't to hurt someone. It's to end the threat so decisively that they never want to test you again. Sarah had earned her black belt in a ceremony that meant more to her than her master's degree. She'd proven herself against training partners who outweighed her by 60 pounds, learning to use leverage, timing, and technique to overcome raw strength. But she'd never advertised her capabilities, preferring to let people underestimate her rather than feel threatened by what she could do. The morning of her first day arrived, with the kind of nervous energy that accompanied stepping into unknown territory. Students filtered into classroom 47 with the wariness of animals entering unfamiliar hunting grounds. Most avoided eye contact, their body language suggesting they'd learned that drawing attention often led to becoming targets. Then Brandon Mitchell made his entrance. Brandon commanded attention the moment he stepped through the doorway. At 17, he stood 6 feet tall, with the kind of wiry strength that came from street fights rather than organized athletics. His brown hair was styled with expensive products, his clothes were designer brands that cost more than most families' rent, and his green eyes held the calculating coldness of someone who'd never faced genuine consequences for his actions. Behind him came his crew. Marcus Rodriguez moved with the compact power of someone trained in violence, his stocky frame and dead eyes suggesting he'd seen things that would traumatize most teenagers. Tommy Chen appeared almost scholarly in comparison, but Sarah recognized the nervous energy of someone always calculating angles and advantages. The trio claimed territory in the back corner through aggressive body language and loud conversations about their weekend exploits involving stolen cars and intimidated freshmen. Other students instinctively created distance around the three boys, forming a buffer zone of empty desks that communicated respect born of fear. This was Brandon's kingdom, and everyone else existed at his pleasure. Sarah observed the social dynamics while organizing her materials, recognizing patterns she'd seen in other dangerous environments. Alpha predators established dominance through displays of power, creating hierarchies that maintained control through psychological pressure, rather than constant physical confrontation. In nature, such behaviors served survival purposes. In educational institutions, they created environments where learning became impossible for everyone. "All right, let's begin," Sarah announced, her voice carrying enough authority to cut through the ambient chaos. "I'm Miss Martinez, and I'll be teaching English for the remainder of the academic year. I know this class has experienced some transitions recently, but I'm committed to being here for the long term." Brandon's laughter erupted like a gunshot, silencing the room instantly. "That's what they all say before reality hits," he called out, making no effort to lower his voice. "This place chews up teachers and spits them out. Give it 2 weeks before you're crying to transfer somewhere safe." The comment hung in the air like a challenge, and Sarah could feel every student in the room watching to see how she'd respond. This was the crucial moment that would determine whether she'd earn their respect or become another casualty in Brandon's campaign of psychological warfare. "I appreciate your concern for my career longevity, Brandon," Sarah replied calmly, "but I've worked in environments that make this place look like a country club. Instead of predicting when I'll leave, why don't we focus on what you're going to accomplish while I'm here?" Marcus snorted, his voice carrying the gravelly tone of someone who damaged his throat in ways Sarah didn't want to imagine. "Lady, you look like you just walked out of some suburban coffee shop. What could you possibly know about tough environments?" The question carried implied threats that went beyond simple disrespect, and Sarah recognized the escalation pattern. These boys were testing her boundaries, probing for weaknesses they could exploit to establish their dominance over the classroom dynamic. "I know that strength isn't about making noise or intimidating people who can't fight back," Sarah responded, her tone remaining level despite the tension crackling through the room. "Real toughness is facing your problems directly instead of taking your frustrations out on others. It's pushing through adversity without looking for someone weaker to blame. And it's earning respect through character rather than demanding it through fear." Brandon's expression darkened as he processed her words. He wasn't accustomed to teachers who pushed back against his provocations, especially not women who looked like they belonged in suburban classrooms rather than reform schools. His uncle's political influence had always been sufficient to make administrators retreat, and his physical presence typically intimidated anyone brave enough to challenge him directly. Respect? Brandon stood slowly, using his height advantage to loom over the classroom. You haven't earned any respect here, Miss Martinez. You're just another do-gooder who thinks she can save us with inspirational speeches and participation trophies. Tommy joined his leader in standing, his movements quick and twitchy like someone perpetually prepared for violence. Yeah, we've dealt with your type before? All talk until things get real, then you run back to whatever safe neighborhood you came from. Sarah remained perfectly still, her breathing controlled and steady. Years of sparring had taught her to read aggression in micro-expressions, subtle weight shifts, and the unconscious preparation movements that preceded actual violence. Brandon and his followers were posturing rather than preparing for real confrontation. They were accustomed to teachers who either submitted or lost their temper, providing ammunition for complaints to administration. I understand you're testing me, Sarah said, her voice maintaining its calm authority despite the obvious threat. That's natural when you've been disappointed by adults who made promises they couldn't keep. But here's what's going to happen. You can choose to sit down and participate constructively in today's lesson, or you can continue this behavior and discover that I'm fundamentally different from the teachers you've encountered before. The classroom fell into dead silence, every student recognizing they were witnessing something unprecedented. Phones appeared discreetly, positioned to capture whatever happened next. This kind of direct confrontation was rare entertainment at Jefferson Academy, where most excitement came from fights during lunch periods or drug raids in the parking structures. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Brandon smiled, but the expression contained no warmth whatsoever. Are you threatening students, Miss Martinez? Because that would be highly unprofessional. My uncle might have serious concerns about teachers who can't maintain appropriate boundaries with minors. It was a sophisticated manipulation, the veiled threat of political retaliation wrapped in fake concern about professional conduct. Brandon had deployed this tactic successfully before, weaponizing his family connections to escape accountability while positioning himself as the victim of aggressive faculty members. Sarah nodded slowly, recognizing the strategy for what it was. You're absolutely correct, Brandon. Threats would be completely inappropriate. That's why I'm making you a promise instead. As long as you're in my classroom, you'll demonstrate respect for yourself, your classmates, and the learning environment. If you're unable to meet that basic expectation, then we'll need to have a different kind of conversation about your future here. What kind of conversation? Marcus demanded, flexing his shoulders in what he probably believed was an intimidating display. Are you going to call our parents? Send us to the principal? Lady, we've heard every threat the system has to offer. Before Sarah could respond, Brandon held up his hand to silence his follower. He was studying the new teacher with the calculating gaze of a predator sizing up unfamiliar prey, trying to understand why her demeanor didn't match his expectations. She wasn't displaying the fear or anger that usually accompanied his intimidation tactics, and her confidence seemed genuine rather than performed. You know what, Miss Martinez? Brandon said, his voice taking on a deceptively friendly tone. I actually respect your backbone. You've got more fight than the last few teachers we've dealt with. But here's the reality check you need. Backbone only matters if you can back it up when push comes to shove. Brandon began walking slowly toward the front of the classroom, his expensive sneakers echoing against the linoleum floor with deliberate menace. Each step was calculated to build psychological pressure, a technique he'd perfected through years of intimidating teachers, administrators, and fellow students who dared to challenge his authority. See, what you don't understand about Jefferson Academy, Brandon continued, now close enough that Sarah could smell his designer cologne mixed with the faint scent of marijuana that clung to his clothes, is that normal rules don't apply here. We're the kids the system couldn't handle, the ones who broke their precious little programs and procedures. Marcus had positioned himself in the classroom door, effectively blocking the primary exit route. It was a subtle but unmistakable message that this confrontation would end on Brandon's terms, not through Sarah's retreat to administrative safety. Tommy had moved to the windows, his nervous energy making him pace like a caged animal anticipating violence. My uncle didn't send me here because he wanted me to learn, Brandon said, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than his earlier shouting. He sent me here because this is where problems disappear. where teachers who don't understand their place get educated about how the real world works. Sarah remained motionless behind her desk, but her mind was processing tactical information with the automatic precision of years of training. Brandon was exhibiting classic predator behavior, isolating his target, controlling the environment, and building psychological pressure before making his move. His followers had positioned themselves to limit her mobility and escape routes, suggesting this wasn't their first coordinated intimidation campaign. Other students had pressed themselves against the walls, creating maximum distance from the unfolding confrontation. Some looked genuinely frightened, while others watched with the morbid fascination of spectators at a gladiatorial contest. Several phones were now openly recording, positioned to capture whatever happened next for immediate distribution across social media platforms. "You want to know what happened to Mr. Peterson?" Brandon asked, referencing Sarah's predecessor. 3 weeks into the semester, he thought he could give me detention for sleeping in class. The next day, someone spray-painted his car. The day after that, his tires got slashed. By week 4, he was begging for a transfer to anywhere that would take him. The implied threat was unmistakable, and Sarah recognized it as another escalation in Brandon's campaign to establish dominance. He was essentially promising that crossing him would result in harassment that extended far beyond school grounds, involving his vehicle, his home, and potentially his family. "Before Peterson, there was Mrs. Chen," Brandon continued, clearly enjoying the storytelling aspect of his intimidation. "Lasted exactly 18 days. Started finding dead rats in her desk drawers. Her classroom got broken into twice. Funny how security cameras never seemed to work when these things happened." Marcus chuckled from his position by the door, the sound carrying undertones of genuine menace. "Tell her about Rodriguez," he suggested, referring to yet another departed teacher. "Ms. Rodriguez thought she was tough because she grew up in East LA, Brandon said, his smile widening. Made it almost a month before someone started following her home from work. Someone started calling her apartment at 3 in the morning. Someone made sure she understood that teaching here came with consequences she wasn't prepared to handle." The pattern was becoming clear to Sarah. Brandon didn't rely solely on classroom confrontations to eliminate teachers who challenged him. He orchestrated campaigns of psychological warfare that extended into their personal lives, using tactics that were difficult to prove but impossible to ignore. His uncle's position provided protection from official consequences, while his crew provided the manpower to execute increasingly creative forms of harassment. "So here's how this works, Miss Martinez," Brandon said, now standing directly in front of Sarah's desk. "You can play along, keep your head down, and maybe last the semester. Or you can keep trying to be the hero teacher who saves us all, and find out exactly how creative my friends and I can get when we put our minds to it." Tommy had stopped pacing, and was now watching the confrontation with intense focus, his hands fidgeting with something in his jacket pocket. Sarah's peripheral vision caught the movement, and her training immediately cataloged it as a potential weapon situation requiring heightened awareness. "I have a third option for you to consider, Brandon," Sarah said quietly, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "You can learn to conduct yourself like someone whose education actually matters to him, or you can discover that I'm not like the teachers you've dealt with before." Brandon's expression shifted from confident amusement to genuine irritation. He was accustomed to teachers who either cowered in fear or exploded in anger, providing him with emotional reactions he could manipulate and report to administration. Sarah's continued calm was disrupting his established playbook. "You really think you're different, don't you?" Brandon said, his voice taking on a harder edge. "You think because you talk tough and don't back down, that makes you special? Lady, I've broken teachers who thought they were tough. I've made grown men cry and beg for transfers to schools in different districts." "Tell her about Williams," Marcus called out, clearly enjoying the psychological pressure building in the room. "Mr. Williams was a former Marine," Brandon explained, his eyes never leaving Sarah's face. Though his military experience made him ready for anything high school kids could throw at him, it took exactly 3 weeks to convince him otherwise. Turns out combat veterans aren't necessarily prepared for the kind of warfare we specialize in here. The reference to psychological warfare was intentional, designed to communicate that Brandon's tactics went beyond simple classroom disruption into realms that could genuinely damage an adult's mental health and sense of security. He was essentially promising a campaign of sustained harassment that would make her life unbearable both professionally and personally. "What makes you think you're different from all of them?" Brandon pressed, leaning forward across her desk. "What makes you think you can handle what we're going to put you through?" Sarah looked up at him with steady eyes, her expression unchanged despite the obvious threat. "Experience," she said simply. The single-word response seemed to catch Brandon off guard. He'd expected either capitulation or escalation, not cryptic confidence that refused to provide him with additional ammunition for his psychological assault. "Experience?" Tommy laughed from across the room. "Lady, what kind of experience could you possibly have that prepares you for this? You look like you've never seen a real fight in your life." "Teaching in Chicago's South Side for 3 years," Sarah replied calmly, "working with kids who'd make your crew look like suburban troublemakers. Dealing with gangs that would consider your intimidation tactics amateur hour." The claim was partially fabricated. Sarah had done some substitute teaching in challenging environments, but her real experience with violence came from entirely different sources. However, the confidence in her voice and the specificity of her reference gave the statement credibility that made Brandon pause. "Chicago's South Side?" Marcus said, his tone shifting slightly. He'd grown up in similar environments and recognized that anyone who'd survived teaching in those neighborhoods possessed a different level of survival instincts than typical suburban educators. "Garfield High School," Sarah continued, naming an institution notorious for its challenges. "Average of 2 security incidents per day. Metal detectors that actually got used. Gang territories that shifted weekly, and students who carried weapons that made whatever you're playing with look like toys." Tommy's hand stopped fidgeting in his jacket pocket as he processed this information. If Sarah had actually survived in that environment, she might possess experience with violence that exceeded their own relatively privileged positions as reform school troublemakers. "You're lying," Brandon said, but uncertainty had crept into his voice. "If you were tough enough to handle that kind of environment, why would you come to a place like Jefferson Academy?" "Because kids like you are exactly why I became a teacher," Sarah replied. "Students who think intimidation makes them powerful, who believe fear equals respect, who've never learned that real strength comes from building others up rather than tearing them down." Brandon's face flushed with anger at being psychologically profiled so accurately. His entire identity was built on dominance through intimidation, and having his motivations dissected so clinically struck at the core of his self-image. "You think you understand me?" Brandon snarled, his carefully maintained composure finally cracking. "You think you can analyze me like some textbook case study? I'm not one of your charity cases, lady. I'm not some troubled kid who needs saving." "No," Sarah agreed. "You're a 17-year-old boy who's learned that his uncle's position makes him untouchable, and who uses that knowledge to terrorize people who can't fight back. The question is, what happens when you encounter someone who isn't intimidated by political connections or teenage posturing?" The psychological reversal was expertly executed. Instead of being intimidated by Brandon's threats, Sarah had turned the conversation into an analysis of his character that exposed his methods as juvenile rather than genuinely threatening. It was a technique she'd learned not from education courses, but from observing how experienced fighters dismantled opponents psychologically before physical confrontation became necessary. Brandon's breathing had become shallow as he processed the reality that his usual tactics weren't having their intended effect. For the first time in his academic career, he was encountering an adult who seemed genuinely unimpressed by his threats and political immunity. "You want to find out what happens?" Brandon said, his voice tight with barely controlled rage. "You really want to test whether your Chicago street smarts work here at Jefferson Academy." Without warning, he swept his arm across Sarah's desk, sending lesson plans, books, and supplies cascading to the floor in a dramatic display of disrespect designed to provoke an emotional response that would give him psychological advantage. The room held its breath, waiting to see how Sarah would respond to this direct assault on her authority and personal property. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees as students recognized that something fundamental had shifted in the confrontation's dynamic. Brandon's moment of triumph was beginning to feel like the calm before a storm he hadn't anticipated. Sarah looked down at the scattered papers and supplies without moving from her position, her expression remaining perfectly composed despite Brandon's blatant act of aggression. Years of combat training had taught her that the most dangerous moment in any confrontation was when an opponent escalated from psychological pressure to physical action. It meant they'd abandoned rational thought in favor of emotional impulse. "Interesting choice," Sarah said quietly, her voice carrying a new edge that made several students shift uncomfortably in their seats. "Destroying school property to make a point about power. Very creative." Brandon stood over the mess he'd created, breathing heavily as adrenaline coursed through his system. The desk-clearing gesture had felt satisfying in the moment, but Sarah's lack of emotional reaction was already making him question whether he'd achieved the psychological victory he'd intended. "Clean it up," Sarah continued, her tone shifting into something that resembled a command more than a request. "Every piece of paper, every pen, every supply that you scattered. Right now." The demand struck the classroom like a thunderclap. In 3 years of reign over Jefferson Academy, no one had ever ordered Brandon Mitchell to clean up his own mess. Students turned to stare openly, abandoning any pretense of avoiding attention as they witnessed what appeared to be a direct challenge to the established hierarchy. "Are you out of your mind?" Brandon laughed, but the sound carried forced bravado rather than genuine amusement. "I don't clean up anything, lady. That's what janitors are for." "Janitors clean up accidents," Sarah replied, stepping around her desk to stand directly in front of him. Despite the height difference, her presence seemed to fill the space between them. "This was deliberate destruction of property, which makes it your responsibility." Marcus moved away from the door, his wrestler's instincts telling him that the situation was shifting in ways that might require his intervention. Tommy had stopped his nervous pacing entirely, his hand now openly gripping whatever object he'd been concealing in his jacket pocket. "You need to step back, Miss Martinez," Marcus warned, his voice carrying the gravelly tone of someone accustomed to settling disputes through violence. "Brandon doesn't take orders from substitute teachers who don't know their place." Sarah's eyes flicked to Marcus without turning away from Brandon. "This doesn't concern you, Marcus. This is between your friend and me, unless you're planning to help him clean up the mess he made." The suggestion that Marcus might involve himself in manual labor drew snickers from other students, breaking some of the tension that had been building throughout the confrontation. It was a calculated psychological move, using humor to diminish the threat while maintaining pressure on the primary target. "Nobody's cleaning up anything," Tommy declared, finally revealing the object he'd been concealing. In his hand was a small digital camera, positioned to record the confrontation from an angle that would capture Sarah's face clearly. Especially not when we're documenting everything for evidence. The camera revelation added a new dimension to the confrontation that Sarah hadn't anticipated. Brandon's crew wasn't just escalating for emotional satisfaction, they were building a case for administrative action that could result in her termination. Any physical contact or aggressive behavior on her part would be captured and edited to present her as the aggressor in a confrontation with teenage students. "Evidence of what, exactly?" Sarah asked, her tactical mind immediately adjusting to this new variable. "A teacher asking a student to take responsibility for destroying classroom property?" "Evidence of an adult threatening minors," Brandon said, his confidence returning as he realized the strategic advantage the camera provided. "Evidence of a teacher creating a hostile learning environment through intimidation and unreasonable demands." The sophistication of their approach was becoming clear to Sarah. This wasn't a random teenage rebellion. It was a coordinated campaign designed to create situations where teachers either backed down or made mistakes that could be used against them administratively. Brandon's crew had likely perfected this strategy through multiple iterations with previous educators. "You see how this works now?" Brandon continued, emboldened by the camera's presence. "You can either apologize for your unprofessional behavior, or you can keep pushing and find out what happens when edited footage of this conversation reaches my uncle's office." Other students were openly staring now, recognizing that they were witnessing something unprecedented in Jefferson Academy's recent history. The school's most feared bully was not only standing his ground against a new teacher, but actively threatening her career through political connections and manufactured evidence. "I understand the game you're playing," Sarah said calmly, her eyes moving between Brandon, the camera, and his position crew members. "Create a confrontation. Escalate until the teacher makes a mistake. then use selective editing and family connections to eliminate another educator who refused to be intimidated. Brandon's smile widened at having his strategy acknowledged so directly. Smart lady. Too bad you figured it out too late to save your career. Here's what you haven't figured out, Sarah replied, taking a deliberate step closer to Brandon despite the camera recording their interaction. I've dealt with intimidation campaigns that make your little operation look like amateur theater. Gang members who actually controlled territory. Students who carried weapons that weren't toys. Threats that went beyond getting teachers transferred. The reference to her fabricated Chicago experience resonated with enough authenticity to make Marcus pause. He'd grown up in environments where violence was currency, and something in Sarah's tone suggested she might possess experience beyond typical suburban education. You're bluffing, Tommy said, but uncertainty had crept into his voice. If you were really street smart, you'd know when to back down from a fight you can't win. Who says I can't win? Sarah asked, her question hanging in the air like a challenge. Brandon's expression shifted as he processed the implications of her response. Most teachers at this point would be seeking administrative intervention, or attempting to de-escalate through compromise. Sarah seemed to be suggesting that she had options beyond retreat or surrender. What's that supposed to mean? Brandon demanded, his voice taking on a harder edge. You think you can threaten us? You think your tough girl act scares anybody here? I think you've made assumptions about what kind of person I am based on appearances, Sarah replied. And I think you're about to discover that those assumptions were incorrect. The classroom had fallen into complete silence except for the hum of fluorescent lighting and the distant sounds of activity in other parts of the building. Every student was focused on the confrontation, phones discreetly positioned to capture whatever happened next for immediate distribution across social media platforms. You want to know what I think? Brandon said, his voice rising as frustration overrode his earlier calculation. I think you're all talk. I think you're just another suburban teacher who watched too many movies about inspiring troubled kids. I think when things get real, you'll fold just like all the others. Without warning, Brandon grabbed the edge of Sarah's wooden desk and flipped it completely over, sending it crashing to the floor with a thunderous bang that echoed throughout the classroom. The heavy furniture landed upside down, its legs pointing toward the ceiling like the remnants of some academic battlefield. The gesture was even more aggressive than his earlier desk clearing, representing complete destruction rather than mere disruption. Students gasped audibly, several jumping back as the massive piece of furniture hit the floor with enough force to rattle windows. There, Brandon announced, his breathing heavy from both exertion and adrenaline. Now you don't have a desk to worry about. Problem solved. Tommy's camera captured every second of the destruction, positioning for maximum dramatic effect. Marcus had moved closer to provide backup if the situation escalated beyond verbal confrontation. Other students were recording on their phones, creating multiple angles of documentation that would ensure the incident lived far beyond the classroom. Sarah stared at the overturned desk for a long moment, her expression unreadable. The piece of furniture that had represented her authority and workspace now lay destroyed, a symbol of Brandon's complete dominance over the educational environment she'd been hired to control. That was expensive school property, Sarah said finally, her voice carrying an ominous calm that made several students step backward. Property that taxpayers purchased for educational purposes. Property that you just destroyed in front of 28 witnesses and multiple cameras. So what? Brandon replied, though something in Sarah's tone was making him uncomfortable. My uncle will make sure nothing happens to me, and you'll be gone by next week anyway. Will I? Sarah asked, moving to stand directly in front of the overturned desk. Are you absolutely certain about that? Brandon opened his mouth to respond, but something in Sarah's posture had changed. She was no longer standing like a teacher managing a difficult classroom situation. Her stance had shifted into something that looked almost predatory, her weight balanced on the balls of her feet and her hands hanging loose at her sides. Because from where I'm standing, Sarah continued, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper, it looks like you just made the biggest mistake of your academic career. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees as students recognized that something fundamental had shifted in the confrontation's dynamic. Brandon's moment of triumph was beginning to feel like the calm before a storm he hadn't anticipated. The change in Sarah's demeanor was subtle, but unmistakable to anyone who'd spent time around genuine predators. Her shoulders had dropped slightly, her breathing had slowed, and her eyes had taken on the focused intensity of someone calculating variables for maximum impact. Students who'd grown up in violent neighborhoods recognized the shift immediately. This was how people looked just before situations turned irreversibly dangerous. "You know what, Brandon?" Sarah said, her voice carrying a new quality that made Tommy's camera hand start to shake. "I've been approaching this all wrong. I've been treating you like a student when I should have been treating you like what you actually are." Brandon felt a chill run down his spine despite his bravado. Something fundamental had changed in the woman standing before him, and his survival instincts were screaming warnings he didn't fully understand. "And what's that supposed to mean?" he managed, though his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. "It means I've been giving you the benefit of the doubt," Sarah replied, taking a step closer to him. "Assuming you were just a confused teenager acting out because of family pressure or social circumstances. But destroying school property while being recorded? That's not confusing behavior, that's criminal behavior." Marcus shifted his weight, recognizing that the conversation had moved beyond typical teacher-student conflict into territory that might require physical intervention. His experience with real violence told him that Sarah's body language had shifted from defensive to offensive, though he couldn't quite identify what made him so certain. "Criminal behavior?" Brandon laughed, but the sound was forced and hollow. "Lady, you're talking about a desk. My uncle probably donates more money to this district in a month than that piece of furniture cost." "Your uncle?" Sarah repeated, nodding slowly. "District Superintendent Williams. The man who's going to protect you from consequences no matter what you do. The political shield that makes you untouchable." She pulled out her phone, and for a moment Brandon thought she was going to call administration. Instead, she opened the camera application and began recording her own footage of the overturned desk and scattered classroom supplies. "What are you doing?" Tommy demanded, still maintaining his own recording but clearly confused by this development. "Documenting evidence," Sarah replied calmly, capturing multiple angles of the destruction while speaking clearly into her phone's microphone. November 15th. Jefferson Reform Academy, Classroom 47. Student Brandon Mitchell, age 17, has just destroyed school property in front of multiple witnesses while being recorded on multiple devices. Brandon felt the first real flutter of concern in his chest. No teacher had ever responded to his intimidation tactics by creating their own evidence file, and something about Sarah's methodical approach suggested she had experience with documentation that went beyond typical educational procedures. "So what?" Brandon said, though his voice lacked its earlier conviction. "You think recording the same thing we're recording changes anything? My uncle will make sure this disappears before it ever reaches anyone who matters." "Will he?" Sarah asked, continuing her documentation while speaking. "Because this footage isn't going to your uncle first. It's going to the district's insurance company, the school board's legal department, and the State Education Oversight Committee. People who care more about liability than political favors." The mention of insurance companies and state oversight struck Brandon like a physical blow. His uncle's influence was extensive within the local district, but it didn't extend to external agencies that operated independently of political pressure. "You're bluffing," Marcus said. But uncertainty had crept into his voice. He'd assumed Sarah was just another teacher who would play by educational system rules, not someone who understood how to escalate conflicts beyond administrative channels. "Am I?" Sarah asked, finishing her recording and slipping the phone back into her pocket. "Marcus Rodriguez, currently facing assault charges in juvenile court. Thomas Chen, whose family operates businesses that attract federal attention. Brandon Mitchell, whose previous incidents of destruction and intimidation have been covered up by family connections." The specific references to their legal situations and family backgrounds sent shockwaves through all three boys. No teacher at Jefferson Academy had ever demonstrated knowledge of their personal circumstances beyond basic enrollment information. "How do you know about that?" Tommy demanded, his nervous energy escalating into genuine agitation. "Teachers aren't supposed to have access to our legal records." "Teachers don't," Sarah agreed. "But people with security clearances do. People who've worked with law enforcement agencies. People who understand how to research individuals who represent potential threats. The revelation that Sarah might possess background investigation capabilities beyond typical educational resources fundamentally altered the power dynamic in the classroom. Brandon's political protection was based on controlling information flow and limiting exposure to authority figures who might take action despite family pressure. "You're lying," Brandon said, but his voice had become strained. "You're just a substitute teacher. You don't have connections to law enforcement or federal agencies." 5 years with the Chicago Police Department's Community Liaison Program, Sarah replied smoothly, the fabrication rolling off her tongue with practiced ease. 3 years working with federal task forces on gang intervention. 2 years consulting on school security assessments for districts with organized crime problems. The fictional background was detailed enough to be believable, especially given Sarah's demonstrated knowledge of their personal situations and her calm response to their intimidation tactics. Marcus, who'd grown up around actual law enforcement interactions, recognized the terminology and approach patterns Sarah was displaying. "If that's true," Marcus said slowly, "why are you working as a teacher at a reform school?" "Because this is where the real work happens," Sarah replied. "Gang intervention doesn't happen in boardrooms or policy meetings. It happens in classrooms where kids make decisions about their futures. It happens when someone finally stands up to bullies who think political connections make them untouchable." Brandon's mind was racing as he processed this new information. If Sarah actually possessed law enforcement connections and federal security clearances, his uncle's district-level influence would be insufficient protection against the kind of scrutiny she could potentially bring to bear. "You're trying to scare us," Brandon said, but his voice lacked any remaining confidence. "Even if you are who you say you are, we haven't done anything illegal. Flipping a desk isn't a federal crime." "Destruction of public property," Sarah replied calmly. "Conspiracy to intimidate educational personnel. Creating hostile environments that interfere with federally funded education programs. And that's just today's activities." She began walking slowly around the overturned desk, her movement deliberate and predatory. "But you're right about one thing, Brandon. Today's incident by itself isn't enough for federal intervention. It's just the final piece of a pattern that's been building for 3 years." Tommy's camera had been recording this entire exchange, but he was beginning to realize that the footage might not provide the protection they'd anticipated. Instead of capturing a teacher losing control or making threats, his documentation was preserving evidence of Sarah methodically building a case against them. "What pattern?" Brandon demanded, though he was beginning to suspect he didn't want to know the answer. "The pattern of systematic intimidation and harassment that's driven 4 teachers from this classroom in 3 years," Sarah replied. "The pattern of destruction and threats that's created a hostile educational environment. The pattern of using family political connections to escape accountability for criminal behavior." She stopped directly in front of Brandon, close enough that he could see the cold calculation in her eyes. "But most importantly, the pattern that's about to end today." The classroom had fallen into dead silence as students processed what they were witnessing. Brandon Mitchell, who terrorized Jefferson Academy for 3 years, was being systematically dismantled by a teacher who seemed to possess resources and knowledge far beyond anything they'd encountered before. "And how?" Brandon asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah smiled, and the expression contained no warmth whatsoever. "That depends entirely on what you do in the next 60 seconds. The countdown has begun, and every person in classroom 47 knew they were about to witness something that would change Jefferson Academy forever." Brandon's breathing had become shallow as the 60-second countdown ticked away in his mind. For the first time in 3 years of terrorizing Jefferson Academy, he found himself facing an opponent who seemed to possess advantages he couldn't neutralize through family connections or physical intimidation. 60 seconds for what? He managed, though his voice had lost all traces of its earlier arrogance. "To prove that you're capable of making better choices," Sarah replied, her tone carrying the finality of an ultimatum. "To demonstrate that underneath all the posturing and political protection, there's still a 17-year-old boy who can learn from his mistakes." Marcus had moved closer to his leader, recognizing that Brandon was struggling with a situation beyond his experience. The stocky wrestler's instincts told him that intervention might be necessary, but something about Sarah's demeanor suggested that physical confrontation would not go in their favor. "And if he doesn't?" Marcus demanded. "What exactly are you planning to do to us?" Sarah's eyes flicked to Marcus with the predatory focus of someone evaluating a potential threat. That's an interesting question, Marcus. Are you planning to interfere with Brandon's decision-making process? Because that would elevate this situation from individual accountability to conspiracy charges. The casual mention of conspiracy charges sent a chill through Tommy, who was still recording but beginning to realize that his documentation might be preserving evidence of their own criminal behavior rather than Sarah's professional misconduct. "This is insane," Tommy muttered, his nervous energy making his hands shake enough to affect his camera stability. "You can't just threaten students with federal charges over a classroom incident." "I'm not threatening anyone," Sarah corrected calmly. "I'm explaining the consequences. Actions have outcomes, and some outcomes extend far beyond school suspension or detention. Brandon destroyed public property while being recorded by multiple devices. That's not a threat. It's documentation." Brandon's mind was racing as he tried to process his rapidly deteriorating situation. His uncle's political influence had always been sufficient to make problems disappear, but Sarah seemed to understand pressure points that existed outside the local education system. "What do you want me to do?" Brandon asked, the question emerging as barely more than a whisper. "I want you to make a choice," Sarah replied. "You can acknowledge that your behavior has been unacceptable, take responsibility for the damage you've caused, and commit to treating this educational environment with respect. Or you can continue down the path you've been following and discover what happens when your actions finally meet consequences that can't be influenced by family connections." The choice Sarah presented was more sophisticated than simple submission or defiance. She was offering Brandon an opportunity to preserve some dignity while accepting accountability, rather than forcing him into a corner where escalation became his only option. "And if I acknowledge the behavior?" Brandon asked, hating himself for even considering capitulation but recognizing that his usual tactics weren't working against this opponent. "Then we work together to repair the damage," Sarah replied. "You help restore this classroom to functional condition. You commit to participating constructively in the educational process. And most importantly, you stop using intimidation and destruction to control other people." Other students were watching this exchange with amazement, witnessing something unprecedented in Jefferson Academy's recent history. Brandon Mitchell, who'd never backed down from any confrontation, was actually considering surrendering to a teacher who looked like she belonged in a suburban coffee shop. "What about the recording?" Tommy asked, gesturing toward his camera. "What about the evidence we've been collecting?" "What about it?" Sarah replied. "You've documented a student destroying school property and a teacher offering him an opportunity to take responsibility for his actions. How exactly do you think that footage reflects your position?" Tommy looked down at his camera with growing horror as he realized that their evidence actually supported Sarah's version of events rather than their intended narrative of teacher misconduct. Instead of capturing an adult losing control, he'd recorded their own escalating criminal behavior. "Delete it," Brandon said suddenly, his voice cutting through the classroom tension like a blade. "Delete the recording, Tommy." "What?" Tommy stared at his leader in shock. "Brandon, man, this is our protection. This is how we make sure she can't." "Delete it now," Brandon repeated, his voice carrying desperate urgency. "All of it. Everything from today." Marcus looked between his friends with growing confusion. "Brandon, what are you doing? We had her beat. We had documentation and everything." "No," Brandon said, his voice cracking slightly. "We had nothing. We had evidence of us committing crimes while she offered us chances to do better. Delete the footage, Tommy." Tommy's hands trembled as he accessed his camera's delete function, the reality of their situation finally penetrating his consciousness. The recording that was supposed to protect them had instead documented their own downfall. "The phones too," Brandon continued, looking around the classroom at students who'd been recording the confrontation. "Anyone who recorded this needs to delete it, now." The request rippled through the classroom as students exchanged glances, recognizing that they'd witnessed something that could have serious consequences for everyone involved. Phones began disappearing as recordings were hastily deleted. Sarah watched this process with satisfaction, recognizing that Brandon was finally understanding the full scope of his predicament. By demanding deletion of evidence, he was acknowledging that the footage supported her position rather than his own. "Good decision," Sarah said quietly. "Now comes the harder part." "Which is what?" Brandon asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Making things right," Sarah replied. "Starting with this classroom." She gestured toward the overturned desk and scattered supplies that represented the physical manifestation of Brandon's destructive behavior. The heavy wooden furniture lay upside down like a defeated giant, its presence dominating the room and serving as a constant reminder of how far the situation had escalated. "You want me to clean this up?" Brandon asked, though the question lacked any remaining defiance. "I want you to take responsibility for your actions," Sarah corrected. "Cleaning up is just the beginning. Real accountability means understanding how your behavior affects other people and making changes that prevent future problems." Brandon stared at the overturned desk for a long moment, wrestling with the decision that would fundamentally alter his position at Jefferson Academy. For 3 years he'd built his identity around dominance and intimidation. Accepting responsibility for his behavior meant abandoning the persona that had defined his entire high school experience. "If I do this," Brandon said slowly, "if I clean up and apologize and all that, what guarantee do I have that you won't use this against me anyway?" "You don't," Sarah replied honestly. "That's what makes it a genuine choice. You're not negotiating from a position of strength anymore, Brandon. You're deciding whether to act with integrity, despite being vulnerable." The brutal honesty of her response struck Brandon like a physical blow. He was accustomed to negotiations where both parties possessed leverage, not situations where he had to rely on someone else's mercy. "This is crazy," Marcus muttered, but his voice lacked conviction. Even he could see that their usual tactics had failed completely against this opponent. "No," Sarah said, her attention still focused on Brandon. "Crazy was thinking that intimidation and destruction would work indefinitely without consequences. This is just reality finally catching up with choices that were made over the past 3 years." Brandon looked around the classroom at the faces watching him, recognizing that his response would define not just his immediate future but his entire remaining time at Jefferson Academy. Students who'd feared him for years were now seeing him reduced to begging for mercy from a teacher he'd tried to break. Slowly, painfully, Brandon Mitchell began walking toward his overturned desk, each step representing the death of his carefully constructed image as Jefferson Academy's untouchable predator. Brandon knelt beside the overturned desk, his designer clothes collecting dust from the classroom floor as he struggled with the weight of the heavy wooden furniture. The desk that had seemed so satisfying to destroy now felt impossibly massive as he attempted to right it, his muscles straining against physics and the symbolic weight of his crumbling reputation. "It's heavier than you thought, isn't it?" Sarah observed, her voice carrying no mockery despite the obvious irony of the situation. "Destruction is always easier than restoration." Marcus stepped forward instinctively, his loyalty to Brandon overriding his confusion about the rapidly changing dynamics. "Let me help you, man." "No," Brandon gasped, his face flushing with exertion and embarrassment. "I did this. I need to fix it." The admission sent ripples through the watching students, many of whom had never heard Brandon Mitchell accept responsibility for anything, let alone publicly acknowledge a mistake. Tommy stood frozen with his now empty camera, processing the complete reversal of everything he'd understood about power dynamics at Jefferson Academy. Sarah moved closer but didn't assist, recognizing that Brandon needed to experience the full weight of his consequences without intervention. Years of combat training had taught her that the most important victories happened in opponents' minds, not through physical domination. "You're struggling because you're trying to lift it straight up," Sarah said quietly. "Try using leverage instead of just strength." Brandon paused in his efforts, sweat beading on his forehead as he looked up at her with a mixture of gratitude and resentment. Taking advice from the woman he'd tried to intimidate felt like another layer of humiliation, but his pride was no longer worth the physical strain. Following her guidance, Brandon repositioned himself and managed to get the desk upright, though the effort left him breathing heavily. The piece of furniture sat slightly askew, one leg shorter than the others from impact damage during its violent overthrow. "Good," Sarah acknowledged. "Now the supplies." Brandon began collecting scattered papers, books, and classroom materials from around the room, each item he retrieved representing another small surrender of his former position. Other students watched in fascination as Jefferson Academy's most feared bully crawled around on hands and knees, gathering the debris of his own destructive impulses. "This is humiliating," Tommy whispered to Marcus, though his voice carried enough volume for others to hear. "He's making himself look weak in front of everyone." "No," came an unexpected voice from across the room. Maria Santos, a quiet junior who'd never spoken up during Brandon's previous terrorizing sessions, found courage she didn't know she possessed. "He's making himself look human for the first time since I've known him." The comment struck the classroom like lightning, students turning to stare at Maria with amazement. Speaking against Brandon Mitchell had been unthinkable for 3 years, but something about watching him take responsibility was inspiring others to find their own voices. "Maria's right," added David Kim, another student who'd suffered under Brandon's intimidation campaigns. "This is the first time he's ever had to face what he does to other people." Brandon's hands stilled as he processed these comments, recognizing that his public accountability was creating space for voices he'd spent years silencing. The realization that his victims were watching his downfall with satisfaction was perhaps more painful than the physical labor of restoration. "Keep working," Sarah instructed, her tone gentle but firm. "The job isn't finished." As Brandon continued gathering supplies, Sarah addressed the broader classroom dynamic that was unfolding. "What you're witnessing here is what accountability looks like. Not punishment imposed by authority figures, but genuine responsibility accepted by someone who caused harm." Marcus shifted uncomfortably, recognizing that the lesson extended beyond Brandon to encompass his own behavior patterns. His role as Brandon's enforcer had contributed to the culture of intimidation that dominated Jefferson Academy, making him complicit in years of psychological terrorism. "What about us?" Marcus asked, his voice uncertain for the first time in memory. "What happens to Brandon's crew if Brandon isn't Brandon anymore?" The question revealed the deeper structural changes that Brandon's transformation would create throughout the school. His followers had built their own identities around serving his dominance, and his capitulation left them without clear direction or purpose. "That depends on what kind of people you choose to be," Sarah replied. "You can continue trying to intimidate others and eventually face the same consequences Brandon is experiencing. Or you can learn from his example and find better ways to interact with your classmates." Tommy's nervous energy had transformed into genuine agitation as he processed the implications of the afternoon's events. His camera, now empty of incriminating footage, felt useless in his hands, a symbol of a strategy that had backfired completely. "This isn't over," Tommy muttered, though his words lacked conviction. "Just because Brandon is having a moment doesn't mean everything changes." "You're right," Sarah agreed, surprising him with her response. "This is just the beginning. Real change takes time, consistency, and commitment. Brandon's actions today matter, but what he does tomorrow and next week will determine whether this transformation is genuine." Brandon had finished collecting the scattered supplies and was now attempting to organize them on the damaged desk. His movements were careful and deliberate, as if handling the materials with respect could somehow undo the violence of their earlier destruction. "I'm sorry," he said suddenly, his voice cutting through the classroom conversations. The words seemed to surprise him as much as everyone else, emerging without conscious decision from some deeper recognition of the harm he'd caused. The apology hung in the air like a foreign language, students struggling to process sounds they'd never expected to hear from Brandon Mitchell's mouth. Some looked skeptical, others amazed, but all recognized that something fundamental had shifted in Jefferson Academy's social order. "Sorry to who?" Sarah asked, recognizing that general apologies were less meaningful than specific acknowledgments of harm. Brandon looked around the classroom, his eyes taking in faces of students he'd terrorized, intimidated, and humiliated over the past 3 years. The weight of accumulated cruelty seemed to settle on his shoulders like a physical burden. "To everyone," he said, his voice growing stronger despite the difficulty of the admission. "To Maria, for making her afraid to speak up in class. To David, for destroying his art project last month. To Carlos, for taking his lunch money and calling it a joke." Each specific acknowledgement drew gasps from students who hadn't expected their individual suffering to be recognized or remembered. Brandon's detailed recall of his cruelties suggested that he'd been more aware of the harm he was causing than anyone had realized. "To Miss Rodriguez, who left because I made teaching impossible," Brandon continued, his voice cracking slightly. "To Mr. Peterson, who transferred schools because I turned his classroom into a battlefield. To every teacher who tried to help us and got driven away, because I thought intimidation made me powerful." The comprehensive nature of his apology was stunning students into silence, many of whom were experiencing their first glimpse of empathy from someone they'd considered irredeemably cruel. Tommy and Marcus exchanged uncertain glances, recognizing that their leader was undergoing a transformation that left them without guidance or direction. And to you, Brandon concluded, looking directly at Sarah, for trying to teach us something important and getting my worst behavior instead of the respect you deserved. Sarah nodded slowly, recognizing the genuine remorse behind his words. Years of working with troubled individuals had taught her to distinguish between manipulative performances and authentic accountability, and Brandon's breakdown appeared to be crossing into genuine territory. Apologies are a good start, Sarah said, but they're just words until they're supported by changed behavior. The real question is what happens tomorrow when you walk into this classroom again. The days following Brandon's public breakdown transformed Jefferson Reform Academy in ways that surprised even the most optimistic faculty members. Word of the confrontation spread through the school's social networks like wildfire, though without video evidence, the story took on mythical proportions as it passed from student to student. Principal Stone noticed the change immediately when she conducted her daily hallway walks. The aggressive posturing that had characterized student interactions for 3 years had been replaced by something resembling normal teenage behavior. Students made eye contact with faculty members instead of looking away. Conversations in the corridors focused on academic subjects rather than planning the next campaign of intimidation. "Miss Martinez," Principal Stone said during their weekly check-in meeting, "I don't know what technique you used with Brandon Mitchell, but the entire school dynamic has shifted. We've gone 4 consecutive days without a single disciplinary incident involving intimidation or bullying." Sarah smiled, careful not to reveal the specifics of her confrontation with Brandon and his crew. Sometimes students just need to understand that actions have consequences, and that there are adults who won't back down from doing what's necessary. What Principal Stone didn't know was that Sarah's transformation extended far beyond her interaction with Brandon. The experience of standing her ground against systematic intimidation had awakened something in her that had been dormant since her fighting days, a recognition that her skills and experience could create change in ways that traditional education methods couldn't achieve. In the week following the desk incident, Sarah had received 3 separate phone calls from teachers at other schools who'd heard rumors about her success with difficult students. Word was spreading through educational networks about the substitute teacher who'd managed to turn around Jefferson Academy's most problematic classroom in a single day. But the real test of transformation was happening in classroom 47, where Brandon Mitchell was proving that his public breakdown had represented genuine change rather than tactical submission. He arrived early every morning to help Sarah arrange desks and prepare materials. His homework assignments were completed with a thoroughness that surprised both him and his teachers. Most importantly, he'd begun actively discouraging other students from disruptive behavior. "Brandon's become like a different person," Maria Santos confided to her friends during lunch. Yesterday, when Jake Williams was giving Mr. Thompson a hard time in math class, Brandon actually told him to show some respect. Can you believe that? The ripple effects of Brandon's transformation were creating changes throughout Jefferson Academy's social hierarchy. Students who'd been victims of intimidation for years were finding courage to participate in class discussions. Teachers who'd grown accustomed to managing hostile environments were rediscovering their enthusiasm for education. Marcus Rodriguez had struggled more than the others with adjusting to the new dynamic. His identity had been built around being Brandon's enforcer, and without that role, he found himself uncertain about his place in the school's social structure. His wrestling background had always given him physical confidence, but he'd never learned to interact with others without the threat of violence underlying every exchange. "I don't know what I'm supposed to do now," Marcus admitted to Sarah during an after-school conversation. "For 3 years, my job was backing up Brandon when he had problems with people. Now he's apologizing to everyone and asking me to do the same. I don't even know how to talk to people without intimidating them." Sarah recognized Marcus's struggle as an opportunity for deeper change within the school community. "What did you enjoy before you started following Brandon's lead? What interested you when you weren't worried about maintaining a reputation?" The question forced Marcus to examine aspects of his personality that had been suppressed for years. "I used to like working with my hands," he said slowly. "Building things, fixing things. My grandfather taught me carpentry before he died, but I stopped doing it because Brandon said it was boring. There's a woodworking program in the basement that's been suspended for lack of student interest," Sarah suggested. "Mr. Patterson has been looking for students who might want to help him restart it." The idea of engaging in constructive rather than destructive activities appealed to something in Marcus that he'd forgotten existed. Within a week, he'd enrolled in the woodworking program and was spending his afternoons learning to create furniture instead of planning intimidation campaigns. Tommy Chen's adjustment had been more complicated, involving family dynamics that extended beyond school boundaries. His nervous energy and need for validation had made him susceptible to Brandon's influence. But without that structure, he'd begun exhibiting anxiety that interfered with his academic performance. "Tommy's been having panic attacks in class," Sarah mentioned to the school counselor. "I think he's struggling with the loss of social structure more than the others." The counselor, Mrs. Williams, had worked with Tommy before and recognized his pattern of seeking approval through problematic behaviors. "He needs positive outlets for his energy and intelligence. Have you considered involving him in the school newspaper? He's got excellent research skills when he's motivated." Sarah approached Tommy with the suggestion during one of his after-school detention sessions, a consequence of his continued disruptive behavior, as he struggled to find his place in the new social order. "You want me to write for the school paper?" Tommy asked, his surprise evident. "Why would you think I'm interested in that?" "Because you've got a talent for gathering information and documenting events," Sarah replied, choosing her words carefully to avoid direct reference to his camera work during the desk incident. "Those are valuable skills that could be used constructively instead of destructively." Tommy's involvement with the Jefferson Academy Herald began hesitantly, but his natural curiosity and ability to investigate stories quickly made him an asset to the small journalism program. Within a month, he was writing articles about positive changes happening within the school community. The transformation of Brandon's crew had ripple effects throughout Jefferson Academy, but the most significant changes were happening in Classroom 47 itself. Students who'd been silent for years began participating in discussions with enthusiasm that surprised even their teachers. The removal of intimidation as a factor in classroom dynamics allowed genuine learning to occur for the first time in recent memory. "I've never seen anything like it," commented Mr. Thompson, who taught mathematics to many of the same students. "Kids who wouldn't speak up for fear of retaliation are now actively engaging with academic material." Maria Santos, who used to sit in the back corner trying to be invisible, gave a presentation on social justice last week that was absolutely brilliant. Sarah's methods had begun attracting attention from educational researchers who were studying effective interventions for at-risk student populations. Dr. Rebecca Morgan from the State University's Education Department had requested permission to observe Sarah's classes as part of a study on trauma-informed teaching practices. "What we're seeing here is extremely rare," Dr. Morgan explained during her initial visit. "The complete cultural transformation of a classroom environment typically takes months or years of intensive intervention. Your students have achieved in weeks what most programs struggle to accomplish over entire academic years." But Sarah understood that her success wasn't replicable through traditional educational techniques. Her confrontation with Brandon had succeeded because of specific skills and experiences that most teachers didn't possess. The combination of combat training, fabricated law enforcement background, and willingness to escalate beyond normal administrative channels wasn't something that could be taught in education schools. The real key was understanding that some students respond to strength rather than kindness, Sarah explained to Dr. Morgan. Brandon had spent 3 years testing teachers to find their breaking points. When he encountered someone who couldn't be broken through intimidation, he had to find new ways to interact. The success story was attracting attention from beyond the academic community. Local news stations had picked up rumors about the dramatic transformation at Jefferson Academy, and several reporters had contacted Principal Stone requesting interviews about the school's improved climate. "We're being cautious about media attention," Principal Stone explained to Sarah. "Students at Jefferson have had enough negative publicity in their lives. If we're going to share this story, it needs to focus on their growth and potential rather than their past problems." Sarah agreed with the approach, recognizing that too much attention could undermine the fragile progress that had been achieved. Students who were just beginning to trust that change was possible might retreat into old patterns if they felt like they were being treated as subjects for public curiosity. The most meaningful validation of the transformation came from an unexpected source: Superintendent Williams, Brandon's uncle, who visited Jefferson Academy for a routine inspection 6 weeks after the desk incident. "I've heard interesting reports about improvements in student behavior," Superintendent Williams mentioned during his meeting with Principal Stone, "particularly regarding my nephew's academic performance." Principal Stone chose her words carefully, aware that the superintendent's family connection complicated any discussion of Brandon's previous behavior. "Brandon has shown remarkable growth in taking responsibility for his actions and supporting a positive learning environment." "I'm pleased to hear that," Superintendent Williams replied. "His parents have noticed changes at home as well. He's been more respectful, more engaged with his studies and less influenced by negative peer pressure. What the superintendent didn't mention was his private conversation with Brandon about the events in classroom 47. His nephew had provided a carefully edited version of his confrontation with Sarah, focusing on her expectations for accountability rather than the specific intimidation tactics he'd employed. "She made me realize that I was wasting opportunities," Brandon had explained to his uncle. "That using your position to protect me from consequences was actually preventing me from learning how to handle challenges on my own." The conversation had surprised Superintendent Williams, who'd grown accustomed to his nephew's complaints about unfair treatment by faculty members. Brandon's willingness to accept responsibility for his behavior suggested maturity that the family had been hoping to see for years. As the semester progressed, Sarah found herself facing a new challenge, managing her own success. The dramatic improvements in Classroom 47 had led to requests for her to take on additional responsibilities within Jefferson Academy. Principal Stone had offered her a permanent position, and several other schools in the district had expressed interest in her methods. But Sarah understood that her effectiveness depended partly on the mystique surrounding her background and capabilities. Too much exposure or analysis might diminish the psychological advantages that had made her initial success possible. "I'm committed to finishing the academic year here," Sarah told Principal Stone during their discussion about permanent employment. "These students deserve consistency, and the progress we've made is still fragile." The decision to maintain her temporary status allowed Sarah to focus on consolidating the changes that had been achieved, while avoiding the administrative pressures that might compromise her unconventional methods. 3 months after the desk incident, Classroom 47 had become a model for the kind of learning environment that educators dreamed of creating. Students arrived prepared for lessons, participated actively in discussions, and supported each other's academic growth. The atmosphere of fear and intimidation had been replaced by genuine curiosity and intellectual engagement. Brandon Mitchell had emerged as an unexpected leader in promoting positive school culture. His transformation from bully to advocate had inspired other students who'd been struggling with behavioral issues. His willingness to acknowledge past mistakes and work toward better relationships had created a template for personal growth that resonated throughout Jefferson Academy. "The most amazing thing is watching Brandon help other students who are having problems," observed Mrs. Williams, the school counselor. "He's become incredibly perceptive about recognizing when someone is struggling, and his advice carries weight because students know he's been through similar challenges." Marcus Rodriguez had discovered a passion for woodworking that was transforming not just his academic experience, but his relationship with his family. His involvement in the school's construction projects had led to part-time employment with a local contractor, providing both income and a sense of purpose that replaced his former role as an enforcer. Tommy Chen's work with the school newspaper had evolved into broader interests in journalism and communications. His investigative skills, once used for gathering intimidation material, were now focused on highlighting positive developments within the Jefferson Academy community. As the academic year drew to a close, Sarah reflected on the unexpected journey that had brought her to Jefferson Academy. She'd arrived seeking a temporary teaching position to pay bills while pursuing more permanent opportunities. Instead, she discovered a calling that combined her unique background with educational purpose in ways she'd never anticipated. The final week of classes brought ceremonies and celebrations that would have been impossible to imagine at the beginning of the year. Students who'd spent months learning to trust each other were planning collaborative summer projects. Teachers who'd been considering transfers to safer schools were requesting to remain at Jefferson Academy for the following year. Brandon Mitchell's graduation speech, delivered to an audience that included family members who'd watched his transformation with amazement, focused on themes of accountability, growth, and second chances. His words carried weight because they came from genuine experience rather than empty platitudes. "I spent 3 years making this school a place where people were afraid to learn, afraid to try, afraid to be themselves," Brandon told the assembled crowd. "Miss Martinez showed me that real strength comes from building others up, not tearing them down. She proved that it's never too late to choose who you want to be." As Sarah watched the graduation ceremony, she understood that her greatest victory hadn't been the confrontation in Classroom 47, but the sustained transformation that had followed. She'd not only stopped a bully, she'd helped create leaders who would carry positive change forward long after her time at Jefferson Academy had ended. The quiet woman who'd once faced down 3 intimidating teenagers in a desperate classroom showdown had discovered that her most powerful weapon wasn't her martial arts training, but her refusal to accept that any student was beyond redemption. And in saving Brandon Mitchell from himself, she'd saved an entire school community from the culture of fear he'd created. Sometimes the most important fights aren't won with physical techniques, but with the unshakable belief that every person deserves the chance to become better than their worst moments. And sometimes, one teacher's courage to stand firm against impossible odds could change everything. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.